So a friend comes up to you and says, "You've been taking that online course on poetry. So perhaps you could tell me why we think of Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud as poetry." And you say, yes, I can. We think of this text as poetry first because when we use the word poetry to mean a kind of literature, we mean a text that has one or more of the following features or characteristics. First, a certain typography, lines with relatively wide or varying margins, often divided up into groups of lines by horizontal space. A certain title. When we use the word poetry to refer to a kind of literature, we have in mind a text that is called something. It's called a poem, or it's a text that's included in a book of poems, or entitled by the first line of the text. Also, certain sounds. We have in mind certain sounds such as meter, the regularity and the number and sequence of stressed and unstressed syllables, and of course, rhyme. And also unusual usage. Certain kinds of unusual linguistic usage are part of our idea of what poetry as literature is. Second, this text, Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, has all of these features. First of all, the typography is consistent with our idea of the typography of poetry, since in most printed editions of the poem, the words are printed in horizontal lines with wide margins and with space between groups of 6 lines. The words, often in many editions at least, the words above the main text are the same as the words in the first line of the text. That is to say, that the first line of the text serves as the title of the poem, which was first published in a work called Poems in 2 volumes, 1807, and then again in a collection of texts called Poems by William Wordsworth in 1815. Thirdly, the sounds of the words in this text are unusual. There is a regularity in the number and sequence of stressed and unstressed syllables. That is to say, it has meter. It has rhyme. And we also can hear other unusual sounds, such as assonance, consonants, and alliteration when we hear I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud read. And finally, this text displays the kind of unusual linguistic usage that we associate with poetry. There's tropological usage, that is to say, Wordsworth uses words which are usually used to refer to one thing, to refer to and describe another thing. And there's also figurative usage in the poem. Wordsworth arranges his words in unusual ways. So that's why we think of this text as poetry. So then your friend might say, well, that's pretty good. That's clear and informative. But let me ask you this. It seems to me that this poem is popular, highly regarded. What is special about this poem? What is good about it? And then you say, well, one way of thinking about the merit and achievement and goodness of the poem is in terms of the kinds of experiences it causes its readers to have. And then your friend might say, well, what kind of experiences does this poem cause us to have? And then, you say, well, I'll speak only for myself, but first of all, the pleasures of hearing, just the sounds of the words in and of themselves is pleasurable to me. I find the sound of the words soothing, charming, a little comforting, a little enchanting, just as I find the sound of some music to be soothing and comforting. Also, the descriptions of the flowers, the sky, the lake, and the land gives me a strong graphic or vivid image of that landscape which Wordsworth is describing. When I read the poem, I can imagine what Wordsworth is describing. And I would also say that the poem changes the way I perceive flowers, daffodils, in a certain way. It changes the way I look at them, at least for a moment. Also, the poem moves me That is to say, it arouses certain emotions in me when I hear it or when I read it. It surprises me a little, makes me feel a little wonder and excitement, makes me feel a little joy, a little happiness, and it uh, comforts me, provides me with a bit of solace. That is to say, it makes me feel some of the emotions that Wordsworth says that he feels in the poem. And also, it provides me with the pleasures of thinking and reflecting about things that at least are important and of interest to me, namely the nature of sensory perception, its relationship to memory, our perceptions of nature, and the kind of value that remembering sensory perceptions of the natural world can have for us. I'm not saying that everybody has these experiences. I'm not saying that you should have them, but they're the ones that I have. And I would also say that judging from the commentary on this poem and other Wordsworth poems over the last 200 years, many others have had, if not exactly these same experiences, experiences of this kind. And they value the poem in part because it does provide them with these experiences of this kind. So then your friend might say, wow, okay, that makes sense, but let me ask you this. How does Wordsworth do that? What is it about the language of the poem that accounts for its powers to provide us with this kind of experience and enjoyment? A kind of experience and enjoyment that, as I understand, Wordsworth was intending to provide to his readers. And then you say, well, yes, yes, I have an answer to that question. It has to do, in general, has to do with the particular sounds, diction, and unusual linguistic usage by virtue of which we think of it as a poem. And then your friend might say, well, could you be more specific? And you say, yes, I can. First, let's consider the sounds, what it is about the sounds that accounts for the poem's powers to provide us with these experiences, which I've just mentioned. First of all, there's the meter and line. There's a fairly regular iambic tetrameter meter, and that is one of the basic things that makes it soothing, comforting, and brings it closer to the rhythms of spoken English, everyday spoken English. Also, most of the lines are end-stopped, though there is a little occasional enjambment. So the poem proceeds one short line at a time, and this makes it relatively simple, clear. It's not intimidating, it's simple, open, clear, relatively easy to understand. And it gives us a sense that while he was excited when he first saw the flowers, Wordsworth is now rather calm, collected, as opposed to wild and out of control. Also, we have four alternate rhyming lines. The rhyme scheme is A-B, and those opening four lines of each stanza are followed by a couplet, two lines, consecutive lines that rhyme. And this gives each group of 6 lines, each stanza, it gives a sense of closure to each stanza and further gives us this impression that utterance proceeds one stanza at a time in a measured, ordered fashion. The repetition of sounds at the ends of lines also enhances, I think, the charming. What is it about the poem that makes it seem charming and that allows it to charm us, to enchant us? Well, that also, I would say, is in part the effect of rhyme. There is also assonance, the kind of repetition, this kind of repetition, the repetition of vowel sounds, I think goes to give us a sense of Wordsworth's loneliness and wistful mood at the outset of the poem. So we get cloud, crowd, those long open vowels. I think it's one of the little things about the sound of the words that goes to our sense of Wordsworth's loneliness and wistful mood just at the outset of the poem. But I think assonance, as in, I gazed and gazed, later in the poem, I think that assonance gives us a sense of Wordsworth's wonder and amazement when he saw the poems. The gentle, soothing tone is also established by some consonants, a repetition of consonant sounds. There's a high density of fricative as opposed to plosive consonants at the ends of lines. And that tends to soften the sound of the poem and create a gentler sound that soothes and comforts. All of these features of the sound also go to make the poem petite, ordered. Even I would use the word elegant and beautiful to describe the poem. And if, as Keats, Wordsworth's great contemporary, Keats, the poet Keats, if, as Keats says, beauty is a joy forever, if beautiful things like this make us feel joy, these aspects of the sounds of the poem are part of what empowers it to make us feel joy. Now, a second thing that goes to the achievement of the poem is the diction, the kind of words that Wordsworth uses in the poem, his vocabulary. In general, Wordsworth avoids long trisyllabic words, words that derive from other languages, such as Greek and Latin. He also avoids technical terms, terms that a botanist, for example, might use to describe daffodils, and words that he avoids words that allude to Greek and Roman mythology, and words that connote Christian stories and worldviews. So he does not use terms such as narcissus or narcissus, pseudo-narcissus, the botanist term for the daffodil. He doesn't use Lenten lily, which was also a common term with Christian connotations that was used to refer to the daffodil in Wordsworth's day. In this poem, Wordsworth uses mainly short, common words, monosyllabic, bisyllabic words. Most of them are also native words. That is to say, they're words that have been in the English language from its very beginnings in the 5th century. They go back to the old Germanic language that was the earliest form of the English language and that is now referred to as Old English. These old, common native words bear out Wordsworth's claim about what he was doing, his claim that his poetry consists of, quote, simple, unelaborated expressions. There is some truth in that claim. However ornate and beautiful and elegant it may be, it is also simple and unelaborated in the sense that the diction is fairly simple, old, common, and native. This diction makes it easy to understand. It's not a challenging, forceful, imposing type of poetic utterance. It's easy to understand, but more important, at least in Wordsworth's mind, this kind of diction is one of the things about the poem that enables it to express emotion and to arouse emotion in his readers. Wordsworth felt that this kind of simple diction was best suited to do what he wanted to do, which was in part to express his emotion and to arouse emotion in his audience. And I think that there is some truth in Wordsworth's claim about how this simple diction works. Now, studying grammar is a way of acquiring a vocabulary that is very useful in relation to the project of describing the language of poetry. Some might argue that daffodil is a proper noun, even though it is not capitalized in most editions of the poem, and it refers not to one individual flower, but a kind of flower. But even if you did want to, even if we do think of daffodil as a proper noun, for the most part, in this poem, Wordsworth avoids that kind of noun. He avoids proper nouns for lakes, such as Ullswater, which is probably the lake beside which he saw the flowers. And he doesn't use place names, proper names to refer to places such as Galborough Park, which is probably where he was when he saw the flowers. He prefers common names, just like cloud, lake, tree, poet, wave. Again, this aspect of the diction goes to the simplicity of the poem, ease of understanding it, distances the poem from a travelogue, makes it a little less specific and more general, maybe a little more speculative. It's not tied down to a particular place. Also, just to use a few further grammatical terms, pronouns, that's an important part of the poem. Why is it that we feel Wordsworth is really giving an account of a particular personal, intense experience of perception and emotion? Well, it's in part because he uses so many first-person singular pronouns, I and me, my. Also, though he is describing an event in the past, I think it's important to notice that he often uses verbs in the present tense, and he uses present participles, dancing, such as dancing. This aspect of his diction, I think, helps to explain why the description of the flowers is vivid and graphic, why we can imagine what Wordsworth saw and continues to see in his mind's eye. Now, at this point, your friend might say, well, that's all right. I can see how these aspects of the sounds of the words and the kind of words that these would cause some of the experiences you have when you read the poem. But what else about the language of the poem accounts for these experiences that you say you have, and that really are the basis for your high estimation of this poem? Well, unusual usage. One of the main things that accounts for the poem's achievements and merits, its powers to provide us with certain experiences, the unusual linguistic usage on display in the poem. The first type of which is tropological usage, or tropes. There are many tropes in the poem. Wordsworth often uses words which are usually used to refer to or describe one thing in order to describe or refer to something else. So, three of the main tropes are simile. We have similes which express a resemblance between Wordsworth and a wandering cloud at the outset, and later in the poem we have a simile that expresses his perception of resemblance between the flowers and stars in the Milky Way. We have metaphorical usage, that is, in particular, Wordsworth uses words which are usually used to describe people dancing, to refer to and describe flowers moving in the breeze, and himself when he remembers seeing the flowers. And the third trope we have is hyperbole. There is some exaggeration in the poem. I think Wordsworth exaggerates the number of flowers he saw when he says that he saw 10,000 of them. And when he says that the flowers extended in never-ending line, that is to say, the distance they covered was infinite, had no end. You know, there are two old observations about tropological usage. Observations that the ancient Greeks and Romans often made, ones that were repeated often in English literary tradition and European literary tradition at large. The first observation is that tropological usage makes descriptions vivid and graphic, with the result that readers and auditors see or imagine what is being described. And the second observation about tropological usage is that it expresses emotion and arouses emotion in those who read and hear the words. I find that these old observations are borne out by this poem. Wordsworth's tropological usage is one of the things that gives me a strong image of the flowers moving in the breeze, and that makes me look at them in a new way. And this tropological usage also gives me the impression that Wordsworth is emotional, that though a little sad and lonely as he wandered like a cloud, he was excited and amazed when he saw the flowers. And these tropes go to give me a sense that he is now happy and joyful as he reflects upon the experience. And because that tropological usage goes to represent or express Wordsworth's emotion, it also is an occasion for me to have some of those feelings as well. The second kind of unusual usage in the poem is figurative usage. There are many figures or unusual arrangements of words in the poem. The ancients also viewed figurative language as a powerful means of expressing and arousing emotion. And I think the figurative language in this poem, though on a fairly small scale, also does this and some other things. In some cases, Wordsworth inverts or reverses the common word order. So, for example, instead of saying, I saw 10,000, he says, 10,000 saw I at a glance. This inversion or hyperbaton, I think, is one of the little things that gives us a sense of Wordsworth's excitement and wonder when he first saw the flowers. 10,000 saw I at a glance. But it's also one of the little things that allows Wordsworth to make his language fit together, to meet the demands of the meter and verse form in which he is writing. To meet, I would also say, to meet the demands of elegance, as Quintilian puts it, right? Rearranging words, inverting them, reversing the common order is one of the little things that allows Wordsworth to make his language fit together and meet the demands of elegance. There's also the occasional repetition of grammatical structures or parallelisms, as in beside the lake, beneath the trees. It's one of the little things that makes it seem that Wordsworth is not carried away by grand towering passion, but that he is calm. He's under control of his feelings, which are strong and deep, but not wild and out of control. And that parallelism makes the utterance balanced and measured beside the lake, beneath the trees. Along with the rhyme and meter, this parallelism, this particular figure, which is referred to as parallelism, makes the utterance itself beautiful, even elegant. And so it's one of the things that may enhance the joy that we take in reading it. I think that there are some very subtle instances of elision also. That is to say, I think if you really look closely at it, I think we feel that some words are omitted. There's a sort of economy of expression and elegance. Again, I want to use the elegance to refer to the nature of the utterance, which derives in part from the way Wordsworth omits unnecessary words, words which usually would be there. And we have small instances of other figures of repetition. First, anaphora. I saw a crowd, a host, right? Two consecutive expressions beginning with the same word, a crowd, a host. It's one small way that Wordsworth slows down the utterance, exfoliates rather than progresses and moves forward. It's one little way in which he conveys his impression, I think, of the superabundance and plenitude of the flowers he saw. Also, ploki, the simple repetition of the same word, as in, I gazed and gazed. Again, I think the figure slows down progression. It retards movement forward. It gives us a sense, and in so doing, it gives us a sense of the wonder and amazement Wordsworth felt when he saw so many daffodils swaying in the breeze by the lake. And the poem concludes in such a simple, comforting manner, in part as a result of a couplet in the form of a polysyndeton. That is to say, the final two consecutive clauses are joined to each other and to the rest of the poem with the conjunction and at the beginning of each item. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So it's mainly these sounds, this kind of vocabulary, these tropes and figures that account for the poem being an occasion for me and others to have the pleasures of hearing the sounds of words, to imagine and see in a different way what the poem describes, to think about the nature of perception, memory, and the natural world, and to feel surprised, wonder, excitement, comfort, and joy. This is how you could respond to your friend's question. What is it about the language of the poem that accounts for its achievement and merit, where merit and achievement is thought of in terms of powers to cause us to have certain experiences? I really hope that by virtue of having done this course, you will have a conversation of this kind in the future. Now, before concluding, I just want to make a few more remarks. The first of which is that I know that over the entire course, we have concentrated on the Wordsworth poem. Most of this has been about the Wordsworth poem. But let me just remind you that I'm really presenting this poem as an example of poetry in English. And I'm presenting my discussion of it over the entire course really as an example of how to use special vocabularies to discuss poetry in English in general. I hope that by seeing how I have discussed this poem, you will learn how to describe other poems in English, to identify their achievements and to account for those achievements, and even to enjoy them more. That's the general idea informing the course. Second, many people teaching English literature these days, I think, object to learning and using the special technical vocabularies we have been using to talk about sound and unusual linguistic usage. And I do concede that we could get by without these special vocabularies, but I want to justify studying them and using them and encouraging you to study and use them just by observing that, first of all, these vocabularies, I think, help us describe with more precision the language of English poetry. I mean, people who aren't familiar with that vocabulary might not know what you're talking about. You might have to provide definitions with some of the terms you use, but for those who are familiar with those vocabulary, they will find your descriptions of poetic language precise and comprehensible if you master this vocabulary. More important, though, is just that studying these special vocabularies and learning how to use them, I think, is a means to an end. It sharpens our perception and understanding of the language of the poetry. Finally, studying and learning how to use these vocabularies, if it involves going to those ancient texts by Aristotle, Cicero, and Longinus, it can really improve our understanding of how sound, trope, and figure work and how they affect readers and audiences. Since in those ancient texts, there's wonderful discussion of how those sounds, tropes, and figures do work and how they affect auditors and readers. The third general point I want to make just before concluding is that I think many students, having taught English literature at universities and several universities over the last 25 years, I think that many students and teachers of poetry really think of poetry as a riddle, essentially as a riddle or a puzzle. And so they think that the main job of reading and criticism is just to solve the puzzle, to identify what the poem means. What does this poem X mean? Seems to be the most pressing question in a lot of discussion of English poetry. In this course, I have been challenging this idea of poetry and the idea that the proper aim of discussion of poetry or literary criticism is just to identify the meaning of the poem. Yes, of course, understanding what the words of a poem mean is very important to our understanding and enjoyment and appreciation of the poem. But to think of poetry as simply as an encoded message and to think of the job of discussion or criticism as merely the identification of that message, I think is a diminishment of poetry and criticism. Let me conclude by encouraging you to think that at least part of the achievement and merit of poetry is its power to cause readers to have certain experiences, pleasurable experiences, valuable experiences that they might not come by elsewhere, that are hard to come by elsewhere. What makes poetry special, valuable, and good is its power to give us sensual pleasures, the pleasures of hearing, its power to make us think, to reflect, to learn, perhaps even to gain wisdom about human life, human existence. Its power to make us feel emotions, and its power to make us see and imagine, to change the way we perceive the world. Understanding the meaning of words is merely a means to this end of experience. And once we start thinking of the merit and achievement of poetry and literature in general in this way, it makes sense to think that one of the main jobs of serious commentary on poetry and literature, literary criticism, is to describe and to explain what it is about the language of poetry that enables it to cause us to have these experiences. And this is what we tried to do with the Wordsworth poem. That's all for now. Farewell.